everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Anatomy of an Adaptation, formerly known as Death by Adaptation. This is a podcast that aims to compare and contrast classic novels with their cinematic adaptations. I originally took a short break, year and a half, from this podcast. Last episode was back in March 2023, talking about Apocalypse Now. And it felt like a good time. I'm feeling good with my life where I'm at right now. I have a little bit of more free time, and I was just longing to talk about books and films, something I'm very passionate about. And I have to thank a very special person and very special host of ClapperCast for making me re-fall in love once again with podcasting, and also kind of pushing me to start again, which is why I'm very happy to reboot Death by Adaptation as Anatomy of Adaptation. I wanted to keep the original name, but thanks to new social media rules, the alternative was calling it Unalived by Adaptation. Otherwise, I would get my accounts nuked on Instagram, TikTok, and all those nice fun places. So here we are, kind of a reboot, a more chill approach to the podcast. Guests coming and going. We'll see how it evolves, just taking it one episode at a time, very relaxing. And I'm very happy that to celebrate, I have Carson Timar, the host of ClapperCast, here to join me to talk about one of our favorite filmmakers who we already celebrated back, I think, 2 years ago, talking about Call Me By Your Name, Andre Aciman's novel, and Luca Guadagnino's adaptation. So why not talk about Luca Guadagnino's adaptation of William S. Burroughs' Queer?
I presume Dumais told you about my proclivities.
Yes. A curse. Been in our family for generations. The Lees have always been perverts.
I shall never forget that. The unspeakable horror that froze the lymph in my glands. The lymph glands, that is, of course, when that baneful word seared my reeling brain. Homosexual. I thought of the painted, simpering female impersonators, I'd seen in a Baltimore nightclub. Could it be that I was one of those subhuman things? I walked the street in a daze, like a man with a light concussion. I might well have destroyed myself, ending an existence which seemed to offer nothing but grotesque misery and humiliation.
Carson, thank you for joining me. So happy to have you on board for this reboot. We're going to just feel it out, see how it goes, see how the conversation evolves. First of all, how are you doing? How's life been treating you over the past year and a half?
Yeah, I've been really good. Thank you for having me on. Let this be a lesson for everyone at home. If you bully your friend enough to start their podcast back up, it will happen.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
works.
yeah, a really great year. I mean, as you mentioned, we've been, I think, killing it on ClapperCast. We really changed that show around to be a lot more based on older films and just celebrating cinema from all ages and all voices. So that's been super, super fun. I think some of the most fun podcasting I've had. So to have another space like this to talk about some really good films and also break down their books and their video games or whatever else they're being adapted from. Maybe we get some theater in there. I think it's a very fun space, and I'm super excited. I mean, you probably picked the best first episode you possibly could for having me on. It kind of feels a little cheap almost. It's like if you you put cheese in the mousetrap, you're obviously going to catch a mouse. You put Luca Guadagnino on this podcast, you're obviously going to catch Carson. So I'm very excited to be here. This should be a very fun one.
Yeah, I'm so happy. It felt like the right time. I'd been toying with the idea for the past few months. I think we even talked about it off mic. And I was like, I want to bring it back. I was like, what's like? How do I start it again? How do I find a format that I like? And I just like having conversations, not really like going into these long-winded, like 15-minute monologues or like, oh, I have a thesis about the book. I'm gonna show it on everywhere. It's like, no, just keeping it relaxed, keeping it nice, and it just felt right that, oh my god, Queer is coming out, Luca Guadagnino's film. I had just read the book back in September because it was premiering at Venice. I didn't attend the festival, but I was like, I just want to prep, that Deathbed Adaptation, now Anatomy of Adaptation mindset was still active. Like, oh, let's do the homework beforehand. Just an excuse to read more Burroughs. We already talked about William Hess Burroughs back with the good Ewan Gledo talking about Naked Lunch, which is a much heavier novel to discuss, not to mention the movie as well of Cronenberg. Brilliant film, but yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. But queer was a great way to come back to this. And I was wondering what attracted you not only to join these episodes, but also to queer outside of the Luca Guadagnino element. Was there something else maybe that made you interested? The title definitely, it's very eye-catching. It's like, oh, queer. Oh, is this about
It's
me?
provocative.
Very
Yeah.
provocative, yeah.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is we can't escape the Luca Guadagnino of it all. I mean, this has been a filmmaker. Obviously, I think we both personally have gone on journeys with and loved, but it's also a filmmaker we've been talking about for years now. I know you did Bones and All on Death by Adaptation, I
Yeah,
believe.
you're
I
right.
think you joined me also on ClapperCast to talk about it. We talked about Challengers earlier this year. We've gone back to a bigger splash. We've talked about Call Me by Your Name, as you mentioned.
Suspiria and
We've
Uncut Gems as
personally
well.
Suspiria and Uncut Gems. I know personally we've talked about We Are Who We Are. I don't think we've done a full podcast on that, but we've both written on that. We've both laughed about Melissa P. Maybe we want to forget that one. That's fine with me. It's a filmmaker that I think we're both very much so drinking the Kool-Aid of, and I mean that in the best of ways. So of course, with every new project, it's going to be exciting. It's going to be something that gets me to the theater as soon as possible. And I did see this on vacation. I did make my way to the theater to go see it because I was so excited for it. But beyond that, I think that even if you remove a lot of his work, Call Me by Your Name was a very touching novel and a very touching film for me. And the idea that he's jumping in with another personal, because that film, even though it's based on a book not written by him, is a very personal film to Luca growing up. Um, and he's been a very personal creator, but the idea that he's coming back to explore the queer identity and aging queer identity again in a project he's called one of his most personal works, that is going to be something that is instantly exciting. um, Debuted at festivals I also did not go to and got mixed reviews, so immediately I knew we were back.
Yeah.
So of course it's a very tempting thing, and of course William Burroughs is one author I've not read a lot of. This is my first William Burroughs book. I
Wow.
also read Queer naturally in preparation for the movie. Um, and it was one author I've desperately wanted to get into. He's been on my list for quite a while, so it's kind of a perfect blending of ideals and things I'm interested in.
Mm.
So of course to then sit down and talk about it. And I also think Luca has been, and go back to our Call Me by Your Name episode. I think Luca's been a fantastic and such a fascinating person when it comes to adaptations. When it comes to taking really interesting Bones and All is another like prime
Yes.
example of this, where he takes something very unique, for better or for worse, and he's really interesting with how he adapts it and how he morphs it and how he changes it. So of course to do an episode, even if we did a Clappercast on this, we also would have been talking about the book. There's no other way, right? We have to, I think, talk about the source material. So luckily you agreed to do this because it didn't really fit on the Clappercast schedule. And I'm thrilled because there's a lot to get into.
100%. It's genuinely impossible. The biggest comparison that I can make right off the bat is to the Coppola adaptation of Dracula, which is not Dracula. It's Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Luca Guadagnino does the same thing here, which has been done in other novels as well, in other adaptations as well. But the movie is William S. Burroughs queered, just like in just like gigantic font on the screen once the movie is over. And I think just talking about the book for a second, I mean, yeah, preamble on Burroughs, regeneration, very controversial writer, fueled by drugs, fueled by this repressed homosexuality, which is incredibly interesting. He didn't identify himself as gay, even though he was. Kind of like, I think the best way I can describe it, having also listened to him in some interviews and reading up on him, he didn't see himself as gay in the way that society painted gay people. These certain expectations, especially coming from the 50s and 60s, like the more effeminate side of things, the vulnerable side of just, the cliche of the gay man. And so that was very intriguing to see him kind of like renouncing this thing. And other queers, other gays were like, yeah, we don't want you in our group. You're way too controversial. You're way too out there. Um, I mean, he was convicted of murder. He did murder his wife, whether intentionally or not. William Tell gone wrong. William Tell routine gone wrong. Um, which is actually the inciting incident of him writing queer. He was in Mexico City, running away from the States. He had just written Junkie, which is very much this novel, also super brief. I like these early books that are just like 100 pages long, which is about, finding shelter and comfort in drugs. Queer is about going off drugs and what that feels like. And he wrote this as he was awaiting trial for having accidentally murdered his wife in Mexico City. And so the story follows, once again, a fictionalized version of himself, kind of like this GI living off very cheaply in Mexico, going from person to person, jumping from man to man, just looking for some sort of connection of bond, something that gives him meaning and joy in life, kind of a sense of belonging, a sense of being seen, but also someone who is really just downright inept at having conversations that are genuine, coming from the heart. He constantly detaches himself when he talks. He gets into these long rants. He talks about like other people, the past, but he never really truly lives in the moment, lives in the present. That is until this William Lee just, becomes smitten with Eugene Allerton, this younger American who just like swoops in his life and is instantly drawn to him, seduces him, flirts, manages to convince him to have sex in a consensual way, in a consensual way, mind you. Um, but the two of them, like this Eugene, is constantly keeping himself detached from Lee, is closing himself off from him. And so the only thing that he can think of is, okay, you know what? I want to connect with you on a deeper level, on a true level. I've heard of this drug, Yahe, which is the ayahuasca. Deep down in the American South, we're going to go there, we're going to try and find it and establish this rapport, kind of like telepathically communicating and bonding with each other. They go there. He's going this, cold turkey, like, oh my God. Just like going off the drugs is killing him. At the same time, the lack of emotional intimacy is also killing him, we could say. I'm just spending time with Eugene, who's almost begrudgingly going along, like, well, sure, you're paying for everything. Why not? I'll tag along. We might have sex like twice a week. We'll see. Always also not identifying himself as gay, which is a very prevalent element of the character. But then the novel just kind of ends. They try to get the ayahuasca from a doctor. The doctor is like, nah, man, I ain't giving it to you. Cut to 2 years later. Eugene is still kind of like, looking for. The two have separated in between, but then, both are trying to reconnect in some way. It's kind of like this open ending, we could even say. But that's kind of it. That's kind of the novel. I'm curious how you felt, Carson, because this was your first time reading Burroughs. I can very much say that compared to what came after, at least like I read Junkie, which came before, which is also very much in a similar style, even though it's all in first person. This is told in third person narration. So it has that element, of distance in terms of narrative, which I find interesting, how at the time of very dark feelings, dark emotions, he was trying to distance himself from his fictional version of himself. But yes, compared to something like Naked Lunch, way easier to read, way shorter as well. How was it for you? Just first impact with Burroughs.
I really loved it. This is might shock some people who follow like the media I tend to connect to, but my favorite, this is hands down my favorite book genre, my favorite novel genre, time period is like 1900s hyper like masculine books. I love Steinbeck, I love Hemingway, I love
Mm,
Nathaniel West. Um, I William Burroughs is just like immediately on that list for me as one I want to check out because not only does he bring the masculine image, and you mentioned he has a lot of the ideals of like the 50s and 60s within his writing and his characters and his persona, and obviously this character is a self-insert character, but he also brings the queerness and that level of queerness in a way that is incredibly vulnerable and incredibly interesting and layered. Queerness is not something you necessarily see reflected in that genre often, and it makes sense, even though there is incredible moments of queerness within Steinbeck, within Hemingway. It's almost unspoken with how you can read between the lines in those books.
Hmm.
Burroughs, seemingly because it's part of his core identity, to a degree that's, I guess up to interpretation in a way. It's explicitly built into his world and into his characters, and he is exploring those emotions. I will say I saw the movie before the book, which is definitely going to be a conversation. I don't know if you did the same, just as far as initiating the story. But I found this book to be really engaging and also just really haunting. Really, just like tragically, brutally. You're watching this queer man just look for connection. This aging queer man who just is like lost. He's just in these bars drinking tequila every night, just trying to be touched, just trying for like the most basic form of connection, and just consistently gets stabbed in the gut by everyone around him.
Yep.
And he just lives with it. He just keeps like he doesn't get out of the tar pit. He just stays in the tar pit. He will go to dinner with a friend and hear the friend talking shit about him and talking about how he's so sick of all the queer shit. And then like he just still goes. It's just he consistently is just lost, but he has no other. It's interesting also because he's like such an ego about him, this character, where he is like, why would this person live in Oklahoma City? And he judges other people for not being open about their queerness and not giving into their desire, but at the same time he's just so like desperately, almost pathetically lost in his desire.
Hmm.
It's wild. It's short. I appreciate that it's short. I appreciate that it's to the point. I agree the ending is a little out of nowhere, but I don't necessarily mind that because I think this is a capturing of a character and I think it captures him well. But just I was like overwhelmingly just like brutal sadness at times. But I mean that in like a really good way. Definitely appreciated the book.
Yeah, I think when you said the word pathetic, it's just perfect to describe this character. I I realized like a couple of years ago, especially having conversations with some friends or family members who have completely different ways of looking at art and just like fictional characters. I am incredibly drawn to the most flawed people. There's something so fascinating to see someone who is a living contradiction, because I think that's the most human feeling of all, in a way. More so often, like in life, from my own experience and my own feelings and emotions and what I see in others, there's always this push and pull between what you want, what you desire, and just not following through with it, not being true and honest to yourself in a way. And so Lee completely embodies that. He's, like you were saying, he's so quick to just judge everyone, puts himself on this like ivory tower of sorts, kind of like, yeah, I'm above all of you, I'm so much smarter, you're like doing this, you're doing that, you think this way, you do that. But at the end of the day, he really wants to belong and fit in with these people. He keeps spending time with these people, even though he sees himself as better than them. And he really just wants the most bare level of intimacy. He manages to get sex, which is easy. You can pay for sex. You can get that touch from a sex worker, uh, from people who have nothing else to lose, that don't want that emotional attachment. And even though he craves that physical touch, at the end of the day, he really wants something deeper from it, which I think is incredibly interesting. And I'm so excited to then talk about the movie as well. But just the way he writes about him, again, just the first person narration and the constant jumping between scenes and moments. There's no real almost reason for certain scenes to exist, we could say, in the terms of a conventional narrative. I would even say that maybe we could classify this as a character study of sorts, even though there's none of that catharsis, none of that satisfaction that you get from other stories with a well-defined arc. And I think the incomplete nature of the novel makes it more interesting than if it had a clearer conclusion, right? Even though it is abrupt, like you said, it leaves you like, oh, that's it. Especially if you've seen the movie and going into it, it's like, oh, this is really very different from where the film goes later on. But there's so many moments, as which you said as well, of just vulnerability in here that is so funny that Burroughs himself didn't see himself as gay or queer, because it's so central to just not even queer identity of the time, but also still now, in a way. It's so easy to connect to it. I found it so easy to connect with certain moments in this, especially as someone who oftentimes really would like to, which is ironic considering doing a podcast, but sometimes I really wish it would be so easy to just ditch the spoken language words and just be able to transcend them in some way, and to feel that frustration from the character, but also from the writing itself. It was just moving. It was just unexpectedly moving. Also from the same novel that just like occasionally would have entire chapters that are, oh, I'm with someone at a bar and he's just reading the newspaper, and we're reading about like a man who goes on or like murders his wife because of jealousy or something like that. Portraying Mexico as this kind of like dangerous place, or Mexico City at least, like in this sort of like dangerous place, not fit for a foreigner, where the foreigner is just not wanted. It just doesn't belong there, which adds to that element of queerness in a way, which is also true to him as a person, right?
I mean, Burroughs wraps up, I think, some of the like deepest fears of the universal like human experience. I think that's the most horrifying existence one can imagine, is just being old and withering away and not having any connection and not having anyone there to not only spend time with, because he has these conversations at the bar and he does have sex, but like he is nobody that he understands on that deeper level. And you're taking that emotion, that universal experience, I think anyone can relate to, and specifically though tying it into queerness in a way that like I think is very pointed and very directed, and it should be. There's so much here about how he wishes he could read people's minds, and how he could telepathically communicate with people, and how he could leave this world behind, because this is a world that like doesn't want him. He lives in Mexico City where they don't want him as a foreigner. He lives in a world where that doesn't really want queers, right? Everyone he communicates with, a lot of the people around him are really anti-queer, pretty to his face. Um, and he's just trapped in like this prison of desire. And I think in that way, I think any individual, but especially any queer person, um, is going to connect to this fear of um, becoming William, right? Like that's, I think, probably the worst reality I can imagine. So I think Burroughs does a wonderful job with that. Obviously, I assume tied to his personal experience. I don't think that's much of a stretch. It's all absolutely there. I do think it's interesting that you mentioned as a character study, because I agree, but this is not a book, and I think anyone who hasn't read this is not a novel that a novella that is about a character going on a journey of growth.
Hmm.
Instead, it's much more a snapshot of a character,
Yeah.
and whatever happens before or after. Obviously, there was a journey here. Maybe there'll be a journey after, I don't know. But this is about a guy who's just explaining who he is, showing him, and he just continues to be him. There is no grand escape at the end, because there's no escaping who you are. And for whatever factor you want to put on it, um, this is who he is. And that is haunting. I mean, I could throw up now just thinking about that concept of just like this idea of you are who you are. That's
Eh,
funny. Um, um, and if you end up just like the slimy guy, that's just who you are. It's unique for sure.
it's tragic. It's just downright
Yeah.
tragic, but also it's human. Like you said, it's very
Yeah.
universal. Um,
It's not fun. I would not say queer. I think I would not describe this novel at any point as being like a fun read. There is definitely like some bitchy gayness, which is like entertaining. But it's like consistently just put within this character who has like just nothing going for him. Um, and I think also for that reason, it has to be short, because like, I don't know if I could spend 20 chapters with this guy I don't know if I would spend $20 or 20 chapters like sitting there just with him for hours, just
Mm.
like doing this cycle, seeing his despair, seeing his loneliness, seeing his desperation for desire, but also he's too pathetic to take action to change that. Again, I think that is one thing that, from what I've seen, is not necessarily discussed with this book too much, but like he chooses to be in this environment. He chooses to conduct himself the way he does. He chooses to just like skate by in life on these GI bills,
Hmm.
and he is not doing anything to give himself momentum. He's just wallowing in this hurt in a way where like you have to feel empathy for him because of his queerness and because of the world he belongs to and how it beats down that identity in a way that I think demands empathy. Uh, Very similar, actually, in a way to where like I think that empathy, comparing the this is gonna be a weird comparison.
Okay.
You compare this, I think, to the film A Different Man this year, as far as taking
Mm.
these characters who are like talking about the invisible barriers and these invisible walls people put up, and what do you do when you just like you feel like you're trapped in this despair, but maybe you're not. You could be doing things to break this despair. I think Queer does a great job building empathy for this character, which you have to have because of the queerness and time that he lives in. I think A Different Man, and this is not a podcast on A Different Man, so we don't need to debate this, but like that film does not build empathy for the character and refuses to accept that there are social factors leading to him wallowing in his despair. And I think like that is something I think Queer does so excellently, is that you both judge him and you both feel nasty and just grossed out by him, and you just like want to scream at him and like, oh my God, what are you doing? But you also like have to kind of love him and feel empathy because you can relate to him and relate to how he feels.
Yeah.
And it carries that tightrope in like 100 pages so well. And it's such a well-defined character study in that way, to where I think it's really quite exceptional in that aspect.
Yeah, and I think it's impossible not to connect it in some way to just the nature of the book as a release, because this was written in, I want to say, like 1959, if I'm not mistaken, 1953, around in the 50s, but it was actually published in 1985, way later. Like Burroughs didn't even want to look at it. He didn't really want to publish it originally, even though the publisher who got junky release was like, yeah, yeah, just give it to me, give it to me. I was like, nah, man, nah, 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 nah. But then, he added an introduction, trying to give it some context, rewrites his own history in a way which is very fascinating, trying to make himself look nicer in the public's eye. But then, yeah, it just, you can tell that this almost feels like someone who really, really hates themselves, like looking at a mirror and seeing a different man to connect it, just seeing someone else there and being like, okay, I'm not writing about myself. I'm writing about that person. And it just hurts so much. Like you can feel the pain, the suffering of him that he was going through at that time through William Lee, through this character. And it's brutal, also kind of dreamy and beautiful. It's so interesting. I'm just so fascinated by how this early in his career he manages to have just like matter of fact moments of borderline documentary writing, like getting lost into the newspaper clippings, getting lost into this like person comes in, like almost theatrical staging feels like person enters, talks, leaves, other one comes through the side, and then he just has these musings and these personal annotations that are just like they hit deeply, and they also hit the reading audience, including very, very young 17-year-old Luca Guadagnino, who read this book, somehow managed to get a hold of it in 1980s Sicily, and he was like, this is me. I feel this. I get this. 17-year-old Italian boy connected to a 50-year-old queer man, ex-GI, living in Mexico City, and he always dreamed of making this book into a film, into an adaptation, which, funnily enough, was already attempted, which is something I didn't know until today, by Steve Buscemi in 2011. He wanted to direct this film. And apparently, according to Wikipedia and some other sources, they had a cast reading at the Sarasota Film Festival with Stanley Tucci, Ben Foster, John Ventimiglia, and Lisa Joyce. So imagine what we would have gotten, Carson, like 2012's Queer by Steve Buscemi, Stanley Tucci playing William Lee. That's like a parallel I cannot even.
Jesus, yeah.
Could have been good. Maybe I like Buscemi as a director. I think I've seen like the COVID movie he made. I don't even remember the name of it. I was like, this is cute. I don't think it even came out. It didn't even get released.
I think Tucci would have been good.
He has that like he was like the perfect non-gay playing the gay, kind of like from the 2000 was like Devil Wears Prada. It was very effeminate characters. You can kind of see him.
Supernova, who played gay in that, I believe.
Ben Foster is interesting. Ben Foster circa 2011 also could have been actually interesting.
I don't think it would be as good as what we got, but I would be fascinated to see it, right? Like I would love to see what it would turn out to be.
Yeah. And I think it feels like a small miracle. Well, definitely for Luca to actually direct Queer as a film, but also to have it exist, because so many of his movies just get announced and get lost into some weird development hell for like a decade before being cancelled off. But to actually have this film starring Daniel Craig and Drew Starkey as William Lee and Eugene Allerton, it's so, like, to me, this felt special, not only because we got two Luca Guadagnino films in 1 year, thankfully to the postponed release of Challengers, but also this was just like disclaimer for the listening audience. I watched this movie literally a week ago at this time. I was just sitting in this giant like IMAX screen at a film festival in Berlin watching Daniel Craig's giant ass projected on the screen. And I was getting lost in it. I was like, this is magical. This is so good. And I've had now a week of time to think about it, to digest it. You've had even longer than me, Carson. I think this might indeed be Luca Guadagnino's best film. I found it to be so rich, so complex, so bold, even in the choice of having a minimalist aesthetic and then to go just full on surreal maximalist in certain moments. He stayed true to Burroughs' writing, not only of Queer, but also his later books. And he truly managed to make something that's a faithful adaptation, but also its own unique creature. I'm so interested to know how you feel about this.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I think the issue with Luca, and it's the best issue you can have, is like you mentioned, is this his best film? And that's a really great question because you look at his list, and I have like my ranking on Letterboxd,
Ooh.
and just his top like 5 projects / films are like literally, and I'm not kidding, 5-star perfect films. So you can put them in like any order outside of Call Me by Your Name, just because that personal connection for me. And I'm like, yeah, I see the argument for why We Are Who We Are is like number 2, or maybe it's Bones and All, or maybe it's Queer, or maybe it's Challengers. Like these are all just like genuinely, when you have flawless films, it's hard to compare.
Changes on a dime,
But
the ranking.
this, right, exactly. But this is undeniably a 5-star perfect film. Like this is um brilliant. As an adaptation, it's wild. It reminds me when I was reading the book so much of Call Me by Your Name as an adaptation, because Luca has this challenge with both novels of turning something so incredibly internal and bringing it to the external in film. This entire film, and it's similar to Call Me by Your Name, where every single glance in that book, you are in Elio's mind, hearing the overthinking, hearing the thoughts, hearing the questioning, hearing the fears, hearing the desires. Very similar in Queer. You get his in real time reaction to every little thing. You hear the hurt, you hear the desire, you hear the pain, you hear the hope, you hear the frustration. And that is something you cannot display because it's not just a constant stream of thoughts. You cannot necessarily easily display in film. So how do you translate that? And what I think Luca is brilliant about in this film is he takes from the queer canon of film and he brings in the production design from Quirrell, which is like so obvious. I can't believe no one's mentioning this. Even more shocking, and I love that it's just because no one knows who the fuck this is other than us, because we, for some reason, obsessed about this guy last year on ClapperCast. He brings in the thoughts of John Couture, who was in the book. They go see him in the cinema.
I forgot
and they
about
watch
that.
Orpheus
Yes.
in the cinema
I was like,
here.
oh, this scene was in the book. Sorry.
Yes, it is in the book. but he brings the filmmaking ideals of John Couture to show desire, similar to what Couture did literally in like the 30s and 40s. And you get these just haunting scenes of these spirits coming together in physical connection as they sit next to each other in the cinema. And then, of course, this human connection when you get to the ayahuasca scene, which is vastly different from the book, and them literally blending into each other, one soul combined. You get so much here where Luca is just a genius in filmmaking when it comes to how do we take this and display all this internal on the external in a way that like only a master can do. And the screenplay here is fantastic from Justin Kurowitz, I believe his last name is,
Yeah,
same guy who did Challengers. Um, I, super cool guy actually IRL. I somewhat know him. But he's really really cool. And does a great job with the screenplay here, but the directing is fantastic. Um, I was never bored by this film. It's interesting watching this without the book. And
mm,
similar to Call Me by Your Name, I'll make the argument. I think like you need to consume both versions to get the complete story. I think with Call Me by Your Name, it's like you need to see both. You need to read the book, you need to watch the movie. Same with Queer. I was never bored by this, but you're just stuck with this guy for like 2 hours. And I know there's also more on the cutting room floor, which I'd be interested to see what's there.
yeah.
Um, I get why it's uneven for sure, and the book is uneven, right? Like there are things about this plot where like that is part of it. But I think this is a really well put together production. And Daniel Craig, oh my gosh, he's like I was a little nervous going into it. I really like Daniel Craig, but I was like, you're leading a gay Luca Guadagnino film. I'm not so sure this is gonna work out, but he's utterly stunning here. As well as the supporting actor whose name I'm blanking on. He's fantastic.
Drew
But
Starkey.
Craig, yes. And Craig, though, I'm so happy he's getting like awards recognition. Shocked by it. Like, could not, would never, would put money down it wouldn't happen. But it seems like it's happening, and I'm very happy because he is great. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think this movie is stunning.
It's, I mean, you never really truly know because there's so many ways an adaptation can go, but this really does feel like the only way you could make a good adaptation of Queer, the book, which is so interesting because so often when I think about Luca Guadagnino, one thing that he gets right is the feeling of time and place. And you always have, we know we love it. That's what we love him. We love to feel, the blood in Suspiria, the hot sun in Call Me by Your Name and the Italian countryside. We love all those just like sweaty shots in Challengers, just the sweat dripping straight on the camera lens. And you get in Queer, and it's all so fake. It all just looks artificial. You mentioned Querelle. Like this was filmed almost entirely, which shocked me. I actually know someone who worked as an intimacy coordinator on this project. They did shoot this almost entirely in studios here in Italy, in Cinecittà in Rome, which could feel like an odd choice, just like compared to what he did before, like shooting on location, having everything feel as real as. But it actually works so well because of just the nature of the book. This is a man who does not fit in, and everything around him feels fake, and he himself is completely removed from it, and it just amplifies that element. And I think what shocked me the most, I had the inverse of you. Like I read the book way before watching the movie, and so for me, what surprised me was like, oh, we have almost beat for beat the same dialogue in this film at certain points. We have the same scenes, which feel like pointless scenes, like not pointless in the literal sense, but like, oh, they don't advance the plot. Oh, what's the point of having this moment in it? It's like it's building so much character, so many feelings, so many emotions, which honestly, like, just from the opening of it, when you just a movie starts and you're in safe hands, those shots of William Lee's bedroom with the Sinead O'Connor cover of All Apologies, I was like, I'm here. This is gonna be good. This is gonna be great. There's a couple Nirvana needle drops, which I didn't even know beforehand, but like funnily enough, um, Kurt Cobain was a big friend of William Burroughs. They kind of like met each other
Oh,
for a few years, those like 3-4 years where one was alive and the other also. Both very, you would think very different people coming from different backgrounds, but they got together. They both enjoyed each other's company. just some they exchange drawings and things like that. So it feels like a little
Wow.
tip of the hat to have like "Calm as You Are" and such. Um, and if you, I don't know if you wanted to mention something about the sound. Prince is also in the soundtrack.
I was just
So
say great soundtrack,
damn.
and then some of the best needle drops of the year. Like one that really does. I think one thing Luca is a master at is creating tone and creating setting. The soundtrack here absolutely propels that, but so does the visual style. His film or his filmography, I think, and this is a fun maybe essay I'll write one day, is like how he uses heat. And I mean like
Mm,
physical heat is so fascinating throughout his films. Because in the Call Me by Your Name, you have like the warmth of summer and you have this dream like state of I want to go back there. That's nostalgia. And here you get like this sweltering, humid, sweaty heat that's so uncomfortable. That is so just like nasty that you feel like you could just like throw up. Like I can just imagine the warmth and the tequila mixing together. Like you can just immediately tell. But I think the soundtrack also goes a long way. It's fascinating how he uses little things. Even the color scheme here. I mean, I think the choice to use to film on sound stages and on fake sets is like perfect. It's what you need here. The colors here, though, I mean, like it evokes such a strong emotion, and he does it everywhere in Bones and all,
mhm.
with how he shoots the Mid South, We Are Who We Are with the Italian towns. Um, some of my favorite scenes of all time come from that show and just wandering around these cities. There's so much here. Challengers, the coldness, the briskness of the night mixed with the heat of when you're on the court and there's sweats just dripping. He uses heat so interestingly, but like it's and he brings a wonderful visual texture to everything. Obviously, I think that's really well documented. Um, but it's also a texture in like audio, in the sounds, in the fonts he uses for the titles.
Yeah.
Everything here, the colors he uses, the artificial blue just splattered on there that just feels so out of place. Everything when you think about it works to like generate a very clear and strong reaction and emotion and feeling. Um, it's an art. It's art. I mean, this is like an
It's hard.
artist controlling every little bit to build something meaningful. And then just the more you know, like the more context you have, right? For John Couture and for Orpheus and what that scene means going through the mirror, that adds like another layer to it. It's so fascinating to like break down a Luca Guadagnino film because there's no one who's doing it quite like him.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
It's so, I mean, say it's personal, it's like duh, but it just comes naturally just by watching it. It does feel like he had these images, these ideas for most of his life, but he manages to improve upon that. I think if he made this movie pre or even right after Call Me by Your Name, it would be very different. Most likely, it wouldn't be as sexually explicit, which is something that I found very, I want to say bold because it sounds like, oh my God, so brave. The gays on screen, they're having anal sex, they're blowing each other. It's like, no, no, no. It's so much, it's so mature without sugarcoating it. I don't know if it makes sense. I've become obsessed over the past like 2 years about just intimacy on screen and the way it can be portrayed. The movie I shot a movie during the summer, short film, which I'm currently almost finished editing, and that has very explicit sexuality in it, which was an interesting challenge to just frame it and portray it in a way that's passionate but also tasteful. And there's something here that I hate the way the way it's getting publicized by like IndieWire or whatnot. I think it was something like it's the year of the comeback or something like that, like some
Oh
terrible pun like
God.
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I was like, it didn't feel like that. Like it never felt like Guadagnino was going for not shock value, but just like, oh my God, is that semen? I didn't even perceive it as such. It's so
Well,
I don't know how you
that's
feel
just because
about
people are
this.
homophobic. Like it's just because they don't actually want to admit that being gay means gay sex, and gay sex makes them really uncomfortable. So when they get
Don't
it,
show it to
or when
me.
they see gay sex, yeah, they want gay stories, but they don't want gay sex. Um, I think Luca could not have made this film another time in his life. Even if you waited a year, this could not be made after Challengers,
Mm,
because this was obviously in production before the huge hit of Challengers. In 2020, he broke up with his longtime partner. So he's an aged guy who is lonely, dealing with these emotions also. And after a success of Calling by Your Name, or after the success of Challengers, I think as far as feeling like you're kind of drifting in life, I'm sure that goes away to a point. While we love We Are Who We Are in Bones and all, it's not like those films necessarily got huge attention from a lot of people. So I think like he had to make this film when he did. Um, but I think there's also such a unique power in this as an adaptation. Would you say like Call Me by Your Name, and this is might sound obvious, so bear with me. Would you say like Call Me by Your Name, and let's specifically say queer? Do you feel a personal reflection of something about you personally within this film
oh, sorry, of myself.
of yourself? Yes.
Oh, totally,
Okay.
totally. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, and then I'll...
No, I do also. And I think the fascinating part here is when you read the book and you mentioned it, you realize how much of this is like a direct adaptation. Yes, Luca does a lot of filmmaking techniques and brings us to life and does make some changes towards the end,
Mhm.
but this is like the same dialogue. This is the same character. And I think there's something beautifully poetic. And it was the same thing with Call Me by Your Name, but I think this is more impactful even, where this guy in the 50s, this queer writer, wrote this book and put his life on the book. Luca Guadagnino saw that as a 17-year-old kid in Italy, connected to it. Now, as a, let's just say, older gentleman, 53 years old, makes the film still connecting to it in life. And us from completely different sides of the world
Literally.
connect to it with different identities, with different how we grow up, different time, like ages, everything about us is different in a lot of ways. And we connect to it. This is all connected on this personal level to where like there's something so William Lee, I wish you saw this, I guess, more. Like, there's something about the fact that we all see something personal in this. And I'm sure it's not just us, obviously. It's a lot of people who are seeing this film. I think there's something so poetically beautiful and just warm about that in a sense of like our stories, our fears, our concerns, our journeys, our demons. They're like all they've always been here, and we can see that, and we can see that within Luca, we can see that within William Burroughs, we can see that within Nicola Grasso, within Carson Tamar, within yourself at home who watched and read this. Please, hopefully you did. um I think there's something beautiful about that, and I think as an adaptation, that is like a beautiful power for this story to have.
Mhm.
um I really am inspired by that.
Yes, it touches something that I truly didn't. I mean, I saw those images in the trailer, which is kind of a shame that they showed those moments in the trailer, even though they're very, still very powerful.
Which the Couture, or I didn't see the trailer, so which...
They have like those couple of snippets of the superimposed, like phantom touch, phantom caresses,
Damn it.
which I was like, fuck. Like, but watching them in the context of the film, especially rereading, I was rereading some passages of the book that actually feature, like what you were saying, just those emotions, those feelings, like wanting in that moment. Like, it's something that I feel often because I'm not. This is getting like we're gonna get super personal already in this episode. I'm not a particularly touchy person. I'm not like someone who goes like slaps and like I like a good hug, but I'm not always like going out like touching people with my hands. Which is like consensually, of course, or whatever. Like even with friends, like you're around with friends, you just like slap each other on the back. Boys going to be boys. Things like that. I've never been like that, and in a way, I kind of wish I was more like that, being able to be more open in that sense, which also translates to intimacy into relationships. When you are with someone that you like, that you are dating or going out with, and just having that moment and feeling of being like, I really want to just hold you, show you my presence on a more like tactile level, which is also trying to touch you in your bones, in your skin, like going deep into your soul in a way through that touch, but ultimately finding myself kind of paralyzed almost by it. And so all those moments, like I've been in those moments during this year where you go with someone like on a date or something to the movies, and you're just thinking like, I really want to just show my presence more during the screening, And then like those moments, this moment when you're watching Orpheus on the screen and you just see the phantom hand just kind of like, it's like, I wish I could do this right now, but just not having that, um how do you say, like, not bravery, it's not brave per se, but it is scary, it is vulnerable, that moment of emotional vulnerability, that might present itself later on in a more private setting, which is exactly what happens in this film. All the moments when Lee wants to be very much more physical with Allerton, um, it's always in public spaces, which kind of plays also into the more openness about his queerness. It's easy to be gay in the
Right.
sheets, but in the streets, it's a bit, like, like, let's keep it like they're two guys, two good friends, just walking along the road. But he wants that. He wants to feel that as well in public. I don't know if I'm
Yeah.
going way out of what the movie and original novel are intending,
No,
but that's how it felt.
absolutely. Because he also judges him for not because mom won't like it. There's so much about mothers also, which is like break that down.
Mommy
But
issues,
a lot of
strong.
mommy issues. But he literally
In
judges
Luca's
him because he's like
filmography in general, to be honest. If you think about it, he
well,
loves his mothers.
sure. He does love mom. He's judges him because he says he refuses to like publicly and openly embrace his queerness and accept his desire because he wants to live up to his mom and expectations.
Hmm.
Um, which is you could talk about queerness. Um, I agree. We don't need to get into like a therapy session here, but physical intimacy and physical connection is also something where I have had my struggles with. And I feel when I like in relationships, both friendships and romantically, um, I feel very connected on like a deeper level, like a soul level, a brain level, where like I wish they could feel that connection that I don't necessarily naturally show through physical interaction, right? In the same sense, physical affection.
Hmm.
I'm not like against it. It's just naturally that's how I feel more connect is on this deeper like level of like I love someone completely and then like I would like it's a deeper level than physical for me. So I agree also that those scenes really touched me on like a really personal level. Um and there's also the sense of like obviously queerness at the time and having to be smart when you're queer, and I guess even now it's not like that's gone away in a lot of cases. You have to be very strategic with how you display queerness for physical safety and physical connection. So like
Hmm.
there's so much here about wanting to break down these barriers, whether they exist or not, of physically touching someone, of having a conversation with someone and understanding are they queer. That's something I love in this movie. That's like such a real life experience of being like, are you
Are you
gay? Are
a
you
little?
like is this are you like what's the tea here? And it can be so awkward and so weird to bring up. And he just wants this telepathy to be able to talk to people and break down those walls, break it that he sees as being a wall between him and again, though it's always on the other person, it's always the other person's not willing to reciprocate or be clear or give in to their desires. It's
Hmm.
never about him. Um, so whether or not you think those walls exist or not, I guess is an individual conversation and up to each individual context. But like, I think it does a wonderful job at showcasing those ideas, and it's something I really connected with.
Yeah, and even the way that what I really liked about the film compared to the book is the character of Allerton, because in the book he always felt just straight up just distance. He's literally kind of like in it just cause, kind of like going with the flow in a very um like detached from life, from joy, from any emotions type of feeling, which creates that allure for Lee. It creates that mystery, like you're just saying, like, is he queer, is he not, like, trying to feel it out. I like how in the movie his friend is just like, well, just ask him. If you ask him, no, 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 you don't do that. You don't do that. Like, building those little walls for yourself is way more fun and also dangerous to just get lost in your own thinking and overthinking instead of just trying to be direct emotionally in some cases. Um, but I like Drew Starkey in this was genuinely a revelation. I am such I We talked about this recently on ClapperCast, talking about like character introductions in David Lynch's films. Luca Guadagnino knows how to introduce a character, knows how to make it memorable, and I think Drew Starkey in Queer is like he's going back to like classical cinema, like fucking Powell and Pressburger 1940s, 1950s filmmaking of just the slow motion, the pan, the close up going in, showing the face, the eyes linking, connecting. In this case, you have Come As You Are by Nirvana playing in the background, which is just instantly one of the great scenes of his filmography. It's like, wow, like you get why, like you watch it and you're like, that's a nice like I'd be interested in just chatting up, see what comes of it. Very alluring character, and then as soon as he tries to flirt in his very clumsy ways, you can already tell that Allerton is not interested. But the way the characters develop this relationship of codependency of sorts, I never really felt. I'm curious to know if you feel similarly, because I never really felt reading the book that Allerton was indeed queer. He goes through the motions, of having those moments of physical intimacy with Lee, of going along with him, kind of like, yeah, that like twice a week, sure, why not? We can have sex, type of thing. But it felt more like just again going through the motions. The same way he goes out with women as well, which is shown in both the film and the book. Is it bisexuality? Is it him hiding his gayness, queerness? Who knows? But in the film, it really did feel, especially towards the end, which is where everything kind of like changes. In the book, oh no, no ayahuasca, sorry, bye, that's it. But in the film, you actually have gender switch of the character of the doctor, Dr. Cotter, who's in this case plays by Leslie Manville. Very crazy, very out there performance, which I loved. Reminded me of all those out there performances he has in his films pretty much nowadays. Um, of like Mark Rylance in Bones and all kind of thing. Um, but she talks to him like they have this moment during the movie where she kind of like pushes him to, okay, you've had this spiritual connection which was truly tender and deep when you consume this forest drug, this bark. It looked like tree bark almost, the ayahuasca. It was like there was something special there, just pursue it. And he runs away from it, and she tells him like, you've opened the door, all you can do is just look away, there's no closing it again. In the film, it really feels like he is renouncing his own queerness, that part of himself. He would rather keep living the like heterosexual normalcy of like running away from it, not wanting to actually engage emotionally with himself, and therefore also with Lee and other people, because it can be scary. I think that also helped. Like recently, this earlier this year, I officially openly came out, and just that feeling of being faced with the obvious, but choosing the safe comfort of, no, 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 no. It's like staying in the closet. It's warm in here. It's cozy. It's very dark. I can't see properly, but it's better than being fully out there in the open, vulnerable, scared again, which is at least something we can say about Lee. There's so many great moments of just Daniel
Yeah.
Craig trying to be flirty. There's little hellos that he makes, little things like, I'm gonna go talk to him. Oh no, shit, oh fuck. And just like changing on the spot, whatever. But at least he is vulnerable, which is the hardest thing to be. He's trying to do it. And Allerton actually runs away from it. I don't know how you felt. I found him to be the most intriguing aspect of of the writing, honestly, in general, in this film.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that's a really good reading of the ayahuasca scene. I assume you've never done ayahuasca. I've never either. It's
Can't say I
something
have.
it's something I've been tempted to do in the past, but I've never actually done it. It's interesting because she does mention like this is going to reveal the truth, and you believe that. Also, though, how the film uses drugs is interesting, right? Because you obviously have Lee's addiction, then they have this ayahuasca drug, which
Mhm.
supposedly, and how do you know what is true? How do you know what isn't true, right? If you take this drug and you're just hallucinating, maybe he is just straight and like that bothered him. I think that's one of the biggest things though, is like you just never know, right? You never know. And he says he's not queer, right? He says he's disembodied, he's not queer, which repeats a few times in the book in the movie. So
Mhm.
that's something to keep in mind. Um, and maybe he doesn't know. I mean, I tend to believe he is queer, right? I mean, that's my reading of the scene, but you never really know. And I think that's part of it is like we're so trapped in our worlds and what everyone else exposes to us and gives to us. It's funny because we'll be talking about this on an upcoming episode of Clappercast we're recording very shortly. But you never really know what the truth is for everyone, and you just have to. This is why he wants telepathy, because he wants to get in there and see it for himself. Um, but I think all signs point to him being queer and just being afraid of that, largely due to the appointment of his parents and of society around him. Um, but you never really know. But the ayahuasca scene is just in general very interesting. This idea that you're opening this door and you can't close the door. You've always will have had this experience. You always will have connected, and they do merge into one person.
Stunning. Oh,
Yeah.
I was levitating during that moment. I was like,
Oh, absolutely.
this is new. This felt like watching finally something that's I haven't seen before. There's so many moments throughout the film that are surreal, like you mentioned, Jean Cocteau. We have also it reminded me a little bit of Buñuel as well. You know, like that
Of course, yeah.
freewheeling, like cut person moving. The only criticism I would have of the film over the book, which comes also from just people that have seen it in Venice that I talked to before watching the film itself, they were just confused by some elements. You know, the entire thing of seeing Lee's wife in the dreams, she's not acknowledged as such. They do the William Tell routine at the end of the film where he kills the guy. They were just confused by those references.
Sure.
Is it necessary to have studied Burroughs' life before watching it? No. Were people making too big of a fuss of not getting those moments because you can still kind of get what they mean in the context? Yes. But I do say I've heard enough criticisms about that maybe, you know, going in knowing those things helped me for sure. A friend of mine was also confused when I saw this movie with them. But uh,
I mean, I agree. I think the whole film, like,
that's how it
because
was
I
for you,
watched it
actually,
again.
right? Like you didn't know about those
Right.
elements.
For sure, and I think in general, the film, even beyond those moments, like, it does take a while to get going.
Mm,
You are definitely a little confused, like, what is exactly happening? What, like, this, you're dropped in this artificial world. Is this guy queer or not? He's acting very strangely. You have some really weird conversations within there. Like, um, there's just the whole thing reeks of like this artificialness. It is a film that is not necessarily welcoming
hmm
to audiences who just are not prepared at all. Friend of Clappercast and friend of Clapper, Chris Santon went and mentioned how in front of him there's a group of teens and like could not imagine just like teenagers going to see this. Or like just like no
Oh
quote
God.
unquote. This is gonna be the horrible thing to say. Like normal people going to see this, just average people off the street. There's no way. I think they're gonna get anything from this. Um, in a way that yes, you could look at that as a negative, but I also don't know. Like, I don't necessarily think films need to be so clear and so welcoming of. Like, I
The
think this
four
demands
quadrant
rewatches.
filmmaking. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I see it, and I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but also like I think this film, for those who it should connect to, because I also don't think this film was meant for universal audiences. I think the people who are supposed to get something from this film are going to get that from the film. Maybe they won't understand all the references, and hopefully it goes to push them.
Yeah.
At the same time, like there are things like no one is understanding the Orpheus bit because they've not seen Orpheus, because they have no idea who John Couture is. It's just a random film that they're watching, right? It's like there's always going to be those things in films. But yeah, I don't know. It doesn't bother me so much, but I see the complaint. I don't want to invalidate the complaint. I think it's just a mindset thing.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it should be something that actually pushes people to read into
Right.
Burroughs, potentially read Burroughs' work, kind of.
Well, and if you see it multiple, like if you see the film twice, right? And I think that's not a harsh thing to expect from audiences. There's a lot of films that don't necessarily make the most sense on a first viewing.
Hmm.
Um, I also think there's enough here to where you might not get exactly the right answers that are in the book, but like there's enough here where you can meditate on those, on like what is this woman doing? Like what is
Yeah.
her relevance? And you can break it down. It's not like it's so abstract to where like I have no idea and there's nothing you can possibly think about. You can still put it together enough, I think, to where and that's a tiny fraction of a very large story of
Hmm.
a lot more happening here on the mind, to where it's not like a make it or break it moment.
Totally, totally. Um, Yeah, I think it goes back kind of like to start drawing this to a close. It goes back to what you said earlier. Like this film had to come out at this time for Guadagnino, especially because he made Challengers. I didn't know what reception it would have, but Challengers is populist entertainment. It's him showing like, hey, I can make the mainstream film that's super fun, watchable. I'm not just making, Tilda Swinton walking around in Italy type films where nothing happens. I can make something more concrete if you want. And he pulled it off. And I think that's like a double-edged sword because now you're gonna have probably like the teenagers that Chris had in front of him, and other people who come into this going, "Yo, do you feel from the director of Challengers?" And they get uh, a 4 minute shot, 5 minute shot of Daniel Craig preparing heroin, which is one of the hardest shots to watch of the entire year. Just like the sound design in that sequence, it's again, it's a pointless scene. Is moving the story forward? No, but that's the entire reason why this film and this story exists. You're seeing this man self-destructing himself through his actions, through his overthinking, through his fear of emotional intimacy and vulnerability. It's so powerful, and just the way Luca Guadagnino creates this with the superimposed images, those surreal trips. The use of miniatures in this is crazy, amazing. Like those exterior shots of the house when the sun shifts, is so beautifully fake. It's just like, oh, that's like the cutest miniature. The airplane lifting off, which is like a like a toy basically, leaving the runway. It's so magical in the way that movies are made. Like it's playing around with the entire toolkit to make something that's not showy like Challengers, but nonetheless very specifically crafted. And I found it to be so just like, mm, one of my favorites of the year, honestly. Like the more I think about it, this might be on the top 10 if I manage to get another rewatch next month when it officially comes out in cinemas here. Could potentially surpass Challengers, even though Challengers is just more watchable, more fun. It just has that energy, that vibe. But it's one of those things, like in the same way that I adore like a John Wick Chapter 4, I can watch it 10 times. A movie that manages actually to hit me just like here right in the heart, like in the guts. It's like, oh, like I've thought about these feelings and these emotions, and just like seeing it on screen feels cathartic. It feels immensely just valuable. Like, oh, thank you, Luca, for making
Thank you,
this.
Luca. I can't believe you have 9 other films that would surpass I mean, like, I get this like top 5-ish for me. The issue with Challengers, and because I've wrestled with this, obviously, in my year rankings and also my
Mm,
Luca rankings, is like, I think Challengers genuinely is maybe that's a crazy statement. It's one of the best crafted films of all time. I think it's just flawless. It is truly like, if you talk about crafting a film, it is like as the best you can possibly be, in my
setups and
opinion.
payoffs, camera work,
Yes.
just pacing. Ooh,
Which makes it really difficult to rank because, like, I think that film is so clean in every possible way. And there is emotional stuff in there, right? There is
mhm.
depth, but that is much
Also very
more,
queer.
it's very queer, but it's not queer, like, not the film queer, right? Queer reflects something on a level that's like, Challengers depth wise is like the short end of the pool. It's not in the deep end with Queer, with Call Me by Your Name, with We Are Who We Are,
Mm,
with even Bones and All, right? Like, I think those films touch so deeply, but like none of them have the craft to the level of Challengers, where I'm like, I have no idea how to rank that top 5. And Challengers is currently my number 1 of the year. Queer is battling it out in that like top 5 to get up there. Um, it's so hard with Challengers because, like, yeah, I didn't really have that emotional takeaway like I did with these films, where I'm like, oh, that's my soul on screen in this way, and this is beautiful. But like, it is just a perfect movie.
mhm.
Um, Maybe that's a good way. Is no, it's just so well done. Um, it's really hard for me to like decipher where that should go in the Luca ranking. Again, after you get that like top 5, you
Hard,
literally could put them in any order,
yes.
and it's like, I get it. Bones and All, I think, is like perfect. I think We Are Who We Are. Please go watch it at home. It's perfect.
Is
We
it?
hopefully we cover it on the podcast
It's like
eventually.
HBO, right? Like I think it's like
It's
on Sky
HBO.
in Europe or something like that. So relatively easily accessible. people have no excuses.
Right.
Go watch fucking
No,
Queer
no
if you want.
excuses, especially now. It's a trans identity in Trump's America. It's incredible. But it's set in Italy, though, to be clear. Um
Vicenza.
it, it's incredible. Like, it's just Luca. Like, it's hard for me because there's conversations about like who's the best filmmaker working today, right? And
Hmm.
it's just like, for me, it has to be Luca. Like, who is doing it like Luca? And I don't want to be like, I think it's a little cheap to be like, he released 2 5-star films in a year because, like, obviously Challengers was meant to be last year. So it's not like
Two in two
there are other
years.
circumstances. But technically, yes, 2 in 1 year. And he has like another one coming next year. And then he has American Psycho, which we'll get there when we get there. Adaptation, maybe. But like, no one is doing it like Luca, to where like truly it's just like incredible. It's always 5 stars, and that's stunning. Especially because he started so low. Like, Melissa P's awful, and then like I haven't seen I Am Love.
I'm Love
I'm
very good.
holding that as like a gem because it's the last one. Really, actually, outside the protagonist, but like I Am Love, it's the last real one. And then A Bigger Splash is good, has issues, but like is getting there. And then from there, it's just like
Call Me by Your
knock
Name
out of the park,
onward.
knock
Yeah.
out of the park, knock out of the park. Um, but I certainly appreciate Queer. I think it's undeniably, let's say, one of his best, one of the best films of the year. Um, I really, and it's just one like, I also think it's one that's going to age so well. Obviously, we're both pretty young.
Oh yeah.
And there are things obviously we can relate to at this current moment, but I think it's one, and that's something about Lucas films, specifically Call Me by Your Name, is like my relationship to that film now compared to when I was a teenager is very different with perspective and experience. Queer is going to be a very similar experience, I can already tell you.
Hmm.
So I can't wait to revisit this film in 10 years and in 20 years, and see how this evolves, and see how this evolves also with Call Me by Your Name, and see how his entire filmography evolves, because it's always evolving even when it's released. And I think that's beautiful. But yeah, I love Queer.
It's amazing. Genuinely, a feat, an achievement of sorts in his filmography. Um, just before we close it off, new little segment that we're gonna be having. Just a little fun little treat. Do you have any favorite quote or passage from the book that resonated with you? If you maybe want to read it or just mention it in passing.
I have one. Let me find it. Okay. The quote says, Lee did not enjoy frustration. The limitations of his desires were like a bars of a cage, like a chain and collar, something that he had learned as an animal learns through days and years of experiencing the snub of the chain, the unyielding bar. Again, I think the book revels in compared to the movie in really showing how trapped and how sad he feels and
Hmm.
how just awful. It's like literally I could just like have a panic attack and throw up thinking about the book. And I think that's a beautiful quote that really shows just how worn down he is and how demonstrating that emotion.
Hmm. Truly, yeah. I had another one as well. Like, there's so many good passages. I'm starting to read. Whenever I read um, books digitally, I try to like save quotes. I'm using an app that just lets you do that, and I got like 20 different quotes from from Queer. But there's this one as I was rereading them, which says, "In any relation of love or friendship, Lee attempted to establish contact on the nonverbal level of intuition, a silent exchange of thought and feeling. Now Allerton had abruptly shut off contact, and Lee felt a physical pain, as though a part of himself tentatively stretched out towards the other had been severed, and he was looking at the bleeding stump in shock and disbelief." If that doesn't paint a picture, like you said, this throwing up, I was like, yeah, it's just very graphic, also very true to those emotions. There's something absolutely brutal of trying to give yourself with like a capital Y, like your full self to someone else and them completely shutting it off, which is the bleeding stump that he mentioned, just like feeling completely empty and bleeding and fun, fun, fun. Just those good emotions, those good feelings. We're starting off with just one of the most uplifting novels and films we could talk about, honestly. Also, with the film, is there any scene that really just or caps or little moment even of a gesture maybe that stuck with you over the past couple of weeks?
I mean, I think it has to be the cinema scene. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, there's also this like It felt like I was at a Marvel panel in Hall H at Comic-Con when, like, John Couture shows up. I'm like, "Holy shit, dude. This is how people feel when Robert Downey Jr. was announced as Green Lantern or whatever he's gonna be."
Jumping in
Doctor
your
Doom,
seat, the only
actually.
one at the press
Yeah. No, I
screening.
was like, "Oh my guys, look, it's Couture." But I think that moment of the phantom connection, as you called it, that phantom touch,
Mm.
um, is just stunning. I think that's, like, a perfect scene. I'm so happy Letterboxd made it one of the headers you could have for the film, one of the backgrounds.
It's my
Immediately changed that
wallpaper
over.
on my laptop now.
Yes, I think that just like is a perfect capturing of everything I love about this film. It's the connection to queer history. It is the longing for touch and desire. It is this. It's just it's perfect. I think.
Mm. That was like I forgot that, which is funny because it was actually one of the saved quotes, the entire passage on Cocteau, but I forgot about it. Then you said, "Oh, there's so much Jean Cocteau in the film as well." And when we got to that scene, I think I slapped my friend. I was like, "Yo, it's Orpheus, it's our boy, Jean." Oh yeah, um, oh that one was amazing. I want to say like tie. It's a tie between the ayahuasca scene, just like because I didn't like, again, it's all new, so it was like fresh. See, like, where are we going here with the story? And that dance, that's also something that already like triggered me in the opening. It was like choreography by two people in the opening credits. I was like, choreography for what? For the sex? No, that's intimacy coordination. Like, choreography for what? And then you get to that moment, which is this dance of literally two bodies trying to become one, not fully becoming one, but just coming and going into each other. It's just magical. But one moment that really truly impacted me in a way I was not expecting is actually the first and almost only sex scene in the film, when they are together in the apartment, which plays out almost entirely without music. It's very explicit without getting graphic, and it felt genuinely passionate and real and raw in a way that's so hard to pull off, to capture, to portray, to show. And there's one moment that was like a little funny um, beat, but also that holds so much depth, I think, is that it's basically Lee giving oral to Allerton, and then after it's done, it's like, this is the end. Just time for the cigarette. It's done. It's not even expecting to be treated in the same way, to having that intimacy reciprocated in a way. He's just happy to give himself fully to the other. And then when Allerton actually turns around and starts unbuttoning his pants, he's like almost ready to lead up the stairs, like, gotta wait, put it on the side, gotta wait. It was funny, like it made a little chuckle, but it felt so disarmingly beautiful. That's like the best way I can put it. I was like, this is so just like, it's not exactly written as that even in the book, which I found interesting. It does feel like it's coming even from maybe like a place of personal experience, of truth, but it's so human, and it was so just like, I was speechless. Like, ayahuasca scene, yeah, amazing, other moments, but just during that moment I was actually like speechless. I was like struggling to be, I was like, this is so beautiful. I was like, Luca done did it again. Done did it again. Final question, Carson, which I think where this might be leading this time around, but which version of this do you prefer of queer? Are you leaning more towards the novel of Burroughs, which you've just finished reading, or the film by Luca, which you've had a couple of weeks to sit on? Maybe it's harder than I thought as a question. Uh,
It's a really difficult question,
hmm,
right? Because again, similar to Calling My Name, I think you kind of need both. I think they both work so well in tandem with each other. I think if it just comes to a vacuum, if I had like someone was like, I'm gonna either watch the book or read the book or watch the movie of Queer to
hmm,
experience the story, which one would you recommend? No shade to anyone. I think I'd go with the book. I think the book just is a little bit more refined, a little bit more clear, a little bit more digestible to where I think you're going to get that character.
hmm.
But I also think the movie's obviously stunning. But I think if you've read the book and you understand this world, going to the movie then is going to be like a transcendent experience. But I think I'm going to go with the book by just like a sliver.
I'm still kind of unsure about my answer. Maybe like talking now, it will come to me, because I found rereading passages of the book after having watched the movie was so much more rewarding in a way than when I first read it back in September. Like it was already starting to grow on me to the point where I was like, why didn't I really love this the first time around? What was keeping me from it? There are definitely characters from the film that come fully to life in a way that it didn't for me in the book. We didn't mention him at all, but he was clearly a fan favorite of the crowd because everyone was loving Joe, aka Jason Schwartzman, completely unrecognizable, just absolutely. I don't know if it was a almost fat suit and great makeup or whatever, but he was a riot at my screening. People loved him. Whereas in the book, I didn't really even think about him. It was just like one of the people that um, Lee meets in the around. And I think he kind of like, Guadagnino kind of like merged some of the characters into him to make him more likable and stand out, kind of give him in this grounded connection. I think I might go with the film, even though I completely agree with what you said. Both are needed in a way that's not like, how you need to do own work to get something, but it does paint the full picture. It does give you this full experience. Where I think kind of the fun of it, and you also said it beautifully earlier, honestly, where we are going to grow with this film and this book the same way that Luca Guadagnino grew with this book. I think I listened to some interviews with him where he was talking about like I kept going back to this, and like every time I read it when I was then 20 and 25 and 30, just like it kept changing the way he saw this character. Also because I think it might be the scariest thing of all. Like you start out being more of the Allerton stand-in, kind of the young one who's maybe unsure of his sexuality, and then you find himself being Glee, 50 plus years old, single, floating freely through life. Maybe brutal, brutal, but poignant, powerful, moving. That's why we love Luca. That's why we love his work. That's why we loved Queer. Carson, thank you so much for joining me on this conversation. This was so much fun, so enlightening. I had an absolute blast talking about Burroughs' Queer and Luca Guadagnino's adaptation. Do you have anything that you want to plug? Some work, some writing, something that the lovely listeners can find you and keep following you.
Yeah, you can find me on Blue Sky and Letterboxd just at Carson Timar. I would recommend you listen to ClapperCast. Nick is on it. If you like this podcast here, this is basically what we do with ClapperCast each week, or every other week, or whenever we get around to it. Reviewing old cinema, new cinema, having a good old time. You can find us on Twitter, probably is the best place, at Clapper Podcast, I want to say. I'm sure if you look ClapperCast up, though, I mean, there's two ClapperCasts. There's one talking about movies, there's one talking about hockey. Obviously, we're the movie one, so you can find us on just like YouTube or any podcast platforms. But yeah, super fun. And thank you for having me on, Nick. I felt bad. Nick, behind the scenes, has been like just opening up suggestions of like, what episodes would people want to do? And I was like, here are my 20 suggestions. So I hope this is good enough for me to come on at least a couple more times. But very happy that this is back going and had a blast today. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm so excited. Anatomy of an Adaptation. This is the rebirth, the phoenix rising from the ashes. This is William Lee going back to the scene of the crime 2 years later and seeing that everything has changed, but nothing truly has changed. you know. Yes, I'm so happy that we're back. The podcast has been updated. We are on Instagram at Anatomy Adaptation Pod. You can follow us there. You can follow us on Spotify if you're listening there, or on YouTube, or on my personal channel, Enjoy the Movies, where also you can find my short films, my work. Be sure to follow me on Blue Sky and Letterboxd, Nicolo Grasso. Stay tuned. We're going to be releasing episodes bi-weekly, monthly, whenever we have time, whenever we are just, happy to do this. This has to be fun, and it definitely was a very, very fun start. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day, evening, afternoon, life. Goodbye.